Hi, today this video is going to examine the logical aspect of our argument. We talked about ethos and pathos, of course, but logos takes a little bit more work because you're actually getting into the logical reasoning, using your facts, your statistics, your evidence to build something that is logically sound, something that can actually convince people that what you say is accurate. Okay? Now, think about the phrase, logical reasoning. It's got reason. So that's what we're talking about from our essay structure, the whole reason-evidence combination. That's what we're looking for here. When we think about logic, there's really two different types of reasoning that we want to be concerned with. The first of those is inductive reasoning, where you go from specific evidence of something happening to a general principle. Another name for this is the scientific method. Okay? Scientific method, as you'll recall from your science classes, is when you observe things happening. You observe them happening enough that you come to some general principle that you believe to be true in every case, so that you do not need to test it indefinitely, but rather eventually you'll know that it's true, or at least have a pretty good idea that it will be. Okay? An example of this would be if I, for instance, go home, eat a sandwich made out of peanut butter, and then an hour later I break into hives. I could make the logical conclusion that, oh, I must be allergic to peanuts. That would not be a very good use of logic, though, because I'm making too big of an inductive leap, okay, which is jumping from evidence to the principle. Okay? The bigger the leap, okay, in other words, the smaller the evidence, my jump to then jumping from that to my conclusion, the bigger that is, the bigger problem, okay, because there's many things that could have caused that allergic reaction. Now, if I go home the next day and have a peanut butter sandwich, and again, I break into hives, and it happens the third day in a row, well, then there's definitely something going on, right? Something is causing those hives. And if everything else is the same, then I need to think about what it could be. Now, it could be the peanuts, but it could be something with the bread, right? I could be allergic to something in that particular part of the diet. I could have also come home away that I got poison ivy, right? I need to look at the whole situation. So then I would start to look at maybe I'll try just eating some peanut butter by itself on a spoon. And if that gives me hives, but nothing else from the situation had occurred, and eventually I'm going to start to figure out, hey, wait a minute, it's not that big of an inductive leap. I think I have a problem with peanuts. But I don't want to do that just based on a small sample. Okay? And in fact, this is something that is so important, this type of inductive reasoning, that's used all the time in polling. Okay? Now, in the United States, there are 320 million people. Okay? But you'll often hear things like 73% of Americans agree with this particular law, right? You know, recently they'll say 90% of Americans think there should be stronger background checks on assault weapons. Or they'll say the president has a 48% approval rating at any given time. Well, for them to ask 320 million people a question, especially one so simple, it would take them years to tabulate the results. And by then, Obama wouldn't be president anymore. The laws have probably changed anyway, right? So these are not exactly valuable things, right? But they don't ask 320 million people. Okay, you may have never been asked these questions, but they still say, you know, this percentage of Americans feel this way. Well, the way they do it in polling is inductive reasoning. They ask a smaller size sample the same question, and then they inductively reason that if this smaller portion believes a certain way, we can make the inductive leap that in general the whole population feels that way. Right? And this is how they come up with polling for any number of things, politics and also other concerns. But you got to make sure that you're asking a representative sample. Okay, and by representative we mean it has to be big enough. So in other words, for 320 million people, I'm not going to ask 5. I'm not going to go up to 5 people and say, what do you think about Obama? And 2 say, yeah, I like him, and 3 say, I hate him. And I say, well, Obama has a 40% approval rating. Yeah, that's illogical, because 5 people is not a big enough size sample compared to 320 million. But maybe I will do a poll of 1,000 people, or 2,000. Still much smaller than 320 million, but it's enough that I'm going to be covering a diversity of ideas. But I also have to make sure the makeup, or the grouping, of who I'm asking is representative of the whole. So I would not just ask people from Northern Illinois, how they feel, right? Which is a state that, voted for Obama. But rather I would ask people from all over the country, different ages, different racial makeups, different ethnicities, different religions, etc., to get a really good picture of the whole United States, right? That's what you have to do for a representative sample. When you don't do this, you get things like Dewey defeats Truman. Right? You may be familiar, or maybe you're not, with this famous picture of Dewey, or with Harry S. Truman holding up a newspaper from the Chicago Tribune saying, Dewey defeats Truman. Yeah, he was holding this up right after Truman, won the election. And you may say, why would the Tribune print a newspaper saying the wrong person won? Well, the problem is that they had to publish the paper before the results were in. And they had done polls that said that Dewey was ahead. But the problem with that is Dewey, the Republican, was favored by more well-to-do people at the time. So they asked a lot of upper-class people what they thought, and they didn't really think to ask lower economic people, minorities, how they felt. And when a lot of them went for Truman, and then the overall electorate went to Truman, well, the Chicago Tribune has been embarrassed for the last several decades. So you got to make sure, like we said, that you ask a representative sample for any question when you're polling. And the same thing is true with our own evidence. You got to make sure you don't just find one case of something happening and then saying that's the whole thing, right? If you're trying to say that, for instance, with the speed limit, it should be 60 miles per hour because 70 miles per hour is unsafe, and you find a case of one person going 70 miles per hour and getting into an accident, that doesn't account for all the other people driving who don't get into accidents. So like I said, it's got to be a good size set of evidence. It's got to be representative of what you're talking about. Okay, that's what inductive reasoning is all about. Now, the other type of reasoning is called deductive reasoning, and this is the exact opposite. Here, you're going from general principles, things that have already been reasoned out through inductive reasoning, and then you're applying them to specific circumstances. And the best way to think of this is, once again, something that comes from our buddy Aristotle. That's the syllogism. Okay, fancy word, all it means is a 3-sentence structure that builds up to deductive reasoning. Okay, and you start with a general principle that has already been shown to be true. Then you apply it to specific evidence to come to some logical conclusion. Okay, now this example is very simple. All men are mortal, meaning all people will die. And if you look at human history, I mean, this general principle has been proven a few billion times over, right? Every single person, spoiler alert, has died. Okay, so that's a general principle that we believe to be true. We have never found evidence that it's not true, so we're going to go with it until we find evidence that it's not true. Then you apply it to a specific person. You take Socrates, another philosopher, say he is a man, right? You look at him, he's a human. And now if those two things are true, the first two things, then logically this third thing has to be true. There's absolutely no way it cannot be true as long as these are true. So that's what deductive reasoning is. It's taking smaller things that you can prove to be true, that you know to be true for your reader, and then building to something else that maybe you hadn't thought about before, but that must also logically be true based on what you just saw. Okay? So that's a syllogism, and of course they get a lot more complex than this as we work on our essays. But I want to show you some possible errors people make in their deductive reasoning. The first one, let's say all men are mortal. Socrates is immortal, therefore Socrates is a man. Okay. Does this make sense? It's just simply the reverse of all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, Socrates is mortal. So all men are mortal, Socrates is immortal, Socrates is a man. Sound good? Well, no, it doesn't. Okay. The problem with this is, let's say all men are mortal, and we agree with it. Socrates is immortal, meaning Socrates will die. But that doesn't necessarily mean he's a man. Okay. Just because all men are mortal does not mean the reverse is true, that all mortals are men. Okay? Socrates could be the name of my dog, right? No, if Socrates is my dog, that means it's mortal, right? Dogs die as well, right? But Socrates is no longer a man in this setup. Okay? So it's kind of the whole thing that math teachers say, all squares are rectangles, but rectangles are not necessarily squares, right? It's that same idea. So what we say is this is not valid. Okay? A valid argument is set up logically, meaning it follows the structure of a syllogism. Okay, so all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, Socrates is mortal. This is a valid argument. Okay, now let's look at another one. This is also a valid argument, though I'm guessing that you're going to have issues. All women are bad drivers. Susie is a woman. Susie is a bad driver. Now, this is a valid argument, because if all women are bad drivers and Susie is a woman, she has to be a bad driver, right? That has to be logically true if these two things are true. So that's valid. The issue, which hopefully is screaming at you inside your mind, is that, but all women are not bad drivers. Okay? And the point is, if either of these are untrue, which this one, sorry fellas, is untrue, statistically, men are worse drivers than women, which is why women pay lower car insurance premiums, right? So women are better drivers, so all women are not bad drivers, okay? That means the rest falls apart, okay? No longer can we confidently say Susie's a bad driver. So it was valid. That's still true that it's valid. But for it to be actually true, it has to be sound. Okay, a sound argument is one based on actually true principles. Okay? So this is both valid and sound, because all men are mortal and Socrates is a man. So therefore the logical conclusion works. This, while valid, is not sound. Okay? And finally, let's say most elderly people are hard of hearing. Okay? Joe is elderly. Joe is hard of hearing. Does that work? Hopefully you are saying that it doesn't, because if I'm saying most, that does not mean all, and therefore it implies that some elderly people are not hard of hearing. So even if these statements are true, the first two, I cannot logically say this. What should I say? You're right, Joe is probably hard of hearing, would fit with the mostly, okay, the most elderly people. So this statement is not qualified, meaning this is not absolute. This is saying most, but all of a sudden I'm saying something with certainty. It doesn't work that way. Okay? So when you're creating your own syllogisms and then building that into your own arguments, make sure that you're starting with statements that you can prove to be true, general principle, something then that's specific evidence applied to that grouping, coming to a logical conclusion. If you do that, you're going to have really strong argumentation that people are going to appreciate and believe.